You know that feeling when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and for a split second, your brain whispers, "Jump"? That's called the call of the void. But what I did wasn't a momentary impulse. It was a calculated, desperate invitation. I was sitting in my apartment, the kind of silence you can only find at 3 a.m., where the hum of the refrigerator sounds like a scream. On the floor was a copy of the Grand Grimoire, its leather so old it felt like human skin. I didn't want wealth. I didn't want power. I just wanted to know if there was something more than this gray, repetitive existence. I traced the ritual circle in salt and ash, my hands shaking so hard I nearly broke the candle. The air in the room didn't just get cold, it got heavy. It felt like the atmosphere was being replaced by lead. I began the incantation, words that weren't meant for human vocal cords, syllables that felt like they were scraping the inside of my throat. "Beelzebub," I whispered. At first, nothing. Just the flickering flame. And then the sound started. Not a bang, not a thunderclap, but a low, rhythmic vibration coming from beneath the floorboards. It sounded like a billion tiny heartbeats. Then came the smell, the cloying, sweet rot of overripe peaches mixed with the sharp metallic tang of a slaughterhouse. I tried to stand up, to blow out the candle, to take it all back. But my feet weren't touching the carpet anymore. The shadows in the corners of the room didn't just move, they unfolded. They stretched out like oily limbs, swallowing the walls, the ceiling, the memory of my home. The floor didn't drop out from under me, it simply ceased to exist. I was falling, but I wasn't moving. And then, as the last flicker of my candle died, I realized the darkness wasn't empty. It was crowded. I wasn't alone in my room anymore. I was standing at the iron-wrought gates of a kingdom that had been hungry for a visitor for 10,000 years. The first night had begun, and the door behind me was gone. When I finally opened my eyes, the world I knew was a bruise-colored memory. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I wasn't even in a place that followed the rules of physics. Imagine standing in the center of a cathedral so vast the ceiling is lost in a toxic amber haze. But it's not built of stone or wood. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the walls were vibrating. I stepped closer, my heart hammering against my ribs, and pressed my hand against what looked like a pillar of black marble. It wasn't cold. It was warm. It was furry. And then it shifted. The entire pillar dissolved into a million black specks that swirled around my head with a roar that sounded like a jet engine. They weren't bricks, they were flies. Trillions of them, clinging to one another, interlocking their legs and wings to create the floors, the arches, and the towering spires of this place. The architecture of flies isn't a metaphor, it's a living, breathing machine of filth. Every time I breathed, I felt them. The air was thick with the dust of shed wings and the pheromones of a hive that had been growing since the dawn of time. I looked down at my feet. The ground felt like deep, expensive carpet, but when I looked closer, it was a carpet of larvae, billions of white, sightless things churning over one another in a rhythmic, mindless tide. They weren't eating anything. They were just waiting. There is no sun here. The light comes from the flies themselves, an iridescent, oily shimmer that coats everything in a sickly green glow. It's the kind of light that makes you feel like your skin is crawling, even when you're standing perfectly still. I walked for what felt like hours, but the geometry made no sense. I'd walk toward a distant archway, only for the walls to peel back and reform behind me. The hive was watching me. It wasn't just a building, it was an extension of him. The buzzing isn't just noise, either. If you listen long enough, and I did because there was nothing else to do, you start to hear patterns. You hear your own name being hummed by a billion tiny mouths. You hear the secrets you never told anyone, vibrated back at you through the walls of the court. By the end of the second day, the thirst started to set in. But there's no water in the Court of Beelzebub. There is only the honey, a thick, black sludge that seeps from the joints of the flywalls. I watched a fly the size of a sparrow land on my hand. It didn't bite. It just sat there, its compound eyes reflecting 1,000 versions of my own terrified face. It felt like it was studying me, like it was reporting back to the throne. That's when the real horror hit me. I wasn't a guest in this court. I was just new material. I was a single, tiny piece of data being processed by a god that thinks in swarms. And I still had 5 days to go. By the 3rd day, the hunger doesn't just growl in your stomach, it becomes a physical weight, like you've swallowed a bag of hot stones. And that's exactly when the invitation arrived. The walls of the great hall didn't open, they simply parted. The trillions of flies that made up the doorway took flight at once, creating a vacuum that nearly pulled the air right out of my lungs. On the other side sat a table that seemed to stretch into infinity, carved from something that looked like ivory but felt like teeth. And there he was. I'd spent my whole life looking at woodcuts and digital art of demons. I expected a goat's head, or wings, or a crown of gold. What I saw was so much worse because it was so much more efficient. He didn't sit on the throne, he was the throne. A towering mass of iridescent, shifting chitin and wet, black fur. He had hundreds of limbs, some like a man's, some like a spider's, all moving in a slow, hypnotic grace that made my head spin. He didn't speak, not with a mouth, anyway. When he talked, every fly in the room adjusted the frequency of its wings. The sound didn't come from him, it came from the air itself. It was a wet, buzzing drone that resolved into words inside my skull. "Eat," the room whispered. "The guest must be sustained." The table was piled high with what looked like a banquet for a king. Roasts dripping with glaze, fruits that glowed with a deep, internal violet light, and wine as dark as a collapsed star. My brain told me it was a trap, but my body was screaming. I reached out and took a bite of a fruit that looked like a pomegranate. The moment it hit my tongue, I almost wept. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted, sweet, tart, and filled with a warmth that spread through my veins like a drug. But then the aftertaste hit. The sweetness vanished, replaced by the unmistakable, oily flavor of decay. It tasted like a funeral parlor. It tasted like the things we hide in the ground. I looked up at Beelzebub, and for the first time, one of his primary eyes, a massive, multifaceted orb the size of a shield, focused on me. I saw myself reflected in it 10,000 times. In each reflection, I was slightly different. In one, I was older. In another, I was a skeleton. In another, I was already one of the flies. He leaned forward, and the smell of the feast changed. The smell of the food was gone, replaced by the overpowering scent of a 1,000-year-old tomb being opened for the first time. You wonder why I am called the Lord of the Feast? The buzzing intensified, vibrating the very teeth in my gums. It is not because I provide the meal. It is because in this court, everything is eventually consumed. The time, the memory, the soul, it all finds its way to my table. You are not a diner, little thing. You are the final course. He picked up a goblet with a hand that had too many joints and toasted me. As he drank, I realized the wine was dripping down his chin and turning into living maggots before it even hit the floor. I wasn't hungry anymore. I felt like a fly trapped in amber, preserved perfectly for someone else's hunger. And as the sun of day 3 faded into that sickly yellow twilight, I realized I hadn't seen a single exit in that entire hall. I was halfway through my stay, and I was starting to realize that Beelzebub doesn't take your life. He just waits for you to realize you don't want it anymore. By the 4th day, the silence of my old life felt like a dream I couldn't quite remember. In the court, there is no such thing as quiet. There is only the hum. But on day 4, the hum changed. It started as a low thrumming in the soles of my feet, vibrating through the floor of living larvae. I was wandering through a corridor of weeping black silt when the sound began to pull apart. It wasn't just the drone of wings anymore. The pitch started to shift, modulating until it sounded like a human throat trying to scream through a mouthful of water. I rounded a corner and stopped dead. In front of me, the wall of flies had recessed into a massive, hollow amphitheater. Suspended in the air by invisible threads of silk were hundreds, maybe thousands, of translucent, amber-colored pods. And inside them were people. Or what used to be people. They looked like wax figures left too close to a fire, features blurred, skin stretched thin over bone, their mouths locked wide in a permanent, oh. They weren't dead. Their eyes were darting back and forth behind milky films, watching me. And they were singing. It wasn't a melody. It was a chorus of the damned. Each one of them was vibrating their vocal cords in perfect synchronization with the flies. When the hive buzzed, they buzzed. When the hive shrieked, they shrieked. It was a collective, biological orchestra. The sound didn't hit my ears, it hit my chest. It felt like my own lungs were trying to sync up with them, like my heart was being forced to beat at their rhythm. I saw a man in a pod close to the front. He looked like he'd been there for centuries. His clothes were ancient, rotted rags that had become part of his skin. As I walked past, his buzzing shifted. It became a whisper, a wet, raspy sound that crawled into my ear. "I only came for a glimpse," he hummed. "I just wanted to see the hidden things. Now I am the song. I am the background noise of the king's dinner." The horror of day 4 isn't the pain, it's the loss of your own frequency. You start to realize that Beelzebub doesn't just cage you. He uses you. He turns your suffering into a vibration that keeps the walls of his palace alive. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound was inside my head. It was playing back my own memories, but distorted. My mother's voice, my first love's laugh, all of it was being chewed up by the chorus and spat back out as a monotonous, buzzing drone. I felt a sudden, violent urge to join them. My throat started to itch. My jaw felt heavy, aching to hang open and let the sound out. I realized that if I stayed in this room for another hour, I'd stop being a person and start being an instrument. I ran. I ran until my legs felt like they were made of glass, bursting through walls of flies that bit at my face as I passed. But no matter how far I went, the chorus followed. It wasn't coming from the theater anymore. It was coming from my own throat. I was starting to hum, and I couldn't make myself stop. By the 5th day, you stop looking for a way out and start looking for a place to hide. But in a palace made of a billion eyes, privacy is a dead concept. I stumbled into a chamber that felt different from the rest. The air wasn't just heavy, it smelled like scorched iron and old, dried blood, the kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat and stays there. In the center of the room, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a statue, a monument to some forgotten brutality. It was a man. Or it had been. He was massive, draped in armor that looked like it had been forged from the black bones of a titan. Even sitting there, broken and defeated, he radiated a kind of violence that made the air around him feel sharp. This was the warlord. A man who, according to the whispers in the walls, had once burned entire civilizations just to see the color of the smoke. On Earth, he was a god of war. He was a footstool. He was kneeling at the base of a secondary throne, his back bent into a permanent curve. His job, his eternal tribute, was to hold up a massive, pulsating egg sac that belonged to the Lord of Flies. It looked like it weighed a ton, and I could see his muscles twitching and tearing under the strain, only to be knitted back together by the flies that swarmed over his open wounds. When he saw me, he didn't move his head. He couldn't. But his voice, it didn't buzz like the others. It was a low, guttural growl that sounded like stones grinding together. "You're the new one," he spat. The effort of speaking made a trickle of black bile run down his chin. "You came here looking for a secret, didn't you? A bit of magic? A bit of power to take back to your little world?" I couldn't even answer. I just stared at the way the flies were burrowing into his shoulder plates. "Listen to me, child," he groaned, the weight of the egg sac shifting with a sickening squelch. "I conquered the known world. I had kings kneeling in my shadow. I thought I was a wolf. But Beelzebub, he doesn't care about your wars. He doesn't care about your pride. To him, a king and a beggar are just different flavors of the same rot. He leaned as far forward as his burden would allow, his eyes burning with a terrifying, lucid madness. "The exit isn't a door," he whispered, the words barely audible over the constant hum of the room. "He doesn't keep us here with locks and keys. He keeps us here with our own desires. I wanted to live forever. I wanted to be remembered. Look at me. I'm remembered. I'm the foundation of his nursery. If you want to leave, you have to leave something behind that you think you can't live without. You have to give up the very thing that brought you here." He let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. A swarm of flies erupted from his mouth, and he went silent again, his body locking back into its position of eternal service. I realized then that the warlord wasn't a prisoner because he was weak. He was a prisoner because he was too stubborn to let go of his own legend. And as I looked at my own hands, I noticed the skin around my fingernails was starting to turn a dull, iridescent green. I was running out of time to decide what I was willing to lose. By the 6th day, the horror isn't happening around you anymore. It's happening to you. I woke up, if you can even call it sleep, feeling a strange, tight pressure across my entire body. It felt like I was wearing a suit of leather that was 2 sizes too small, and every time I breathed, I could hear a faint, rhythmic creak coming from my own ribs. I tried to rub my eyes, but my fingers felt heavy. They were stiff, the joints locking into place with a wet, mechanical click. I crawled over to a pool of that oily black honey to see my reflection, and I screamed, or I tried to. What came out was that same vibrating hum I'd heard from the chorus on day 4. My skin wasn't skin anymore. It had hardened into a dull, translucent shell, like the casing of a cicada. Underneath that shell, I could see things moving. My muscles were liquefying, turning into a pale, milky slurry that churned with a life of its own. I watched, paralyzed, as a thin, black hair, thick as a needle, pushed its way through the pore of my forearm. Then another. Then dozens. I wasn't just dying, I was being repurposed. This is the Great Metamorphosis. It's the moment you realize that Beelzebub doesn't just want your soul, he wants your biology. He's an artist, and your humanity is just raw clay. I felt my jaw start to split, the bone unhinging to make room for something else. My vision began to fracture, breaking apart into 1,000 tiny hexagons. I could see everything at once, the ceiling of flies, the crawling floor, the distant, pulsing throne, all overlapping in a chaotic, dizzying kaleidoscope. The pain was secondary to the humiliation of it. You feel your memories, your first kiss, the smell of rain, the sound of your own name, being compressed into a single, overwhelming instinct. Serve the hive. Feed the king. I looked at my hands again. The fingernails had fallen off, replaced by sharp, hooked claws designed for clinging to the walls of the court. I realized that the people I saw in the pods on day 4 weren't just prisoners. They were the lucky ones. They had stopped halfway. I was going all the way through. I tried to think of my home, my apartment, the salt circle on the floor, but the thoughts were slippery. They felt like they belonged to someone else, a character in a movie I'd seen a long time ago. The only thing that felt real was the vibration in the air. The king was calling, and for the first time, I felt a sickening, primal urge to answer. I had 24 hours left. If I didn't find that sacrifice the warlord talked about, I wouldn't be walking out of that court. I'd be flying out as just another nameless part of the architecture. The 7th night didn't arrive with a sunset. It arrived with a sudden, violent silence. Every fly in the palace stopped buzzing at once, and that transition from infinite noise to absolute nothingness felt like a physical blow. It was the trial of wills. I was dragged, or perhaps my new, twitching limbs moved on their own, back to the foot of the great throne. Beelzebub wasn't moving. He sat there like a mountain of dead stars, his thousands of eyes fixed directly on the spot where I knelt. My shell was almost complete now. I could feel the cold air of the court against the wet, new parts of me that were still hardening. "The week is done," the air hissed. This time, the voice didn't come from the room. It came from inside my own chest, vibrating out of my newly formed spiracles. You have seen the beauty of the swarm. You have tasted the feast. You have heard the song. Now you must choose. Do you join the chorus, or do you pay the price to remain small? I tried to speak, but my tongue was a thick, useless muscle. I had to think the words. What is the price? The Lord of Flies leaned down, his massive, chitinous face inches from mine. I could see the tiny mites crawling over his eyes, the vast machinery of a god that manages decay. The warlord gave his pride. The singers gave their voices. To leave this place, you must leave the thing that makes you you. I do not want your blood. I want your memory of home. He reached out a needle-thin finger and touched my forehead. Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. My childhood bedroom. The way the light hit the trees in the park near my house. My mother's face. The specific, comforting smell of old books. Give them to me, he whispered. Forget the world above, and I will let your body return to it. You will walk the streets of your city, you will sleep in your bed, but you will be a hollow vessel. You will never feel the warmth of those memories again. You will be a stranger in your own life. That was the trap. If I stayed, I became a monster. If I left, I became a ghost. I looked at the warlord in the corner, still holding that pulsating egg sac, and I realized why he was still there. He couldn't bear to be forgotten, and he couldn't bear to forget himself. He chose the pain over the emptiness. My will was fraying. I felt the hive mind reaching into my brain, trying to weave my thoughts into the collective. It would be so easy to just stop fighting, to let the buzzing take over. I had to decide right then. Was my humanity worth more than my life? I closed my fractured, compound eyes and reached into the center of my being. I grabbed onto the most painful, most beautiful memory I had, the feeling of being truly, deeply loved, and I held it like a jagged piece of glass. I didn't give it to him. I used it to cut. I screamed, not with my voice, but with every ounce of my soul, projecting that one memory of pure, human heat against the cold, dead vacuum of the court. The vibration was so intense that the walls of flies began to shatter. I am not yours, I thought, the words burning like fire. The last thing I saw was Beelzebub's massive eye cracking like a mirror, reflecting a million versions of a man who was still, somehow, human. And then the darkness finally became real. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I felt wasn't relief. It was the weight of the air. On Earth, we don't realize how heavy the atmosphere is until we've spent time somewhere where the air doesn't push back. I was lying face down on my apartment floor, my cheek pressed against the cold, hardwood slats. The silence of the room was so loud it made my ears ache, a sharp, ringing vacuum that felt like a physical pressure. I tried to move, and a white-hot bolt of agony shot through my spine. My body felt wrong. It felt like I had been folded into a box that was far too small and then roughly shaken out. When I finally managed to roll over and push myself up, I saw the remains of the salt circle. It wasn't white anymore. It was charred black, as if a lightning strike had hit the center of my living room. I looked at my hands. They were human, pale, shaking, and covered in a layer of fine, gray ash, but human. There were no claws, no chitin, no needle-thick hairs. I let out a sob, a ragged, wet sound that felt like sand in my throat. I was back. But as I stood up, stumbling toward the bathroom, I realized the shattered return wasn't just about coming home. It was about what I brought back with me. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face, but the water didn't feel refreshing. It felt thin. Everything felt thin. The walls of my apartment looked like they were made of cardboard. The sunlight peeking through the blinds felt artificial, like a low-budget stage light. The reality I had fought so hard to keep felt like a flimsy veil draped over something much larger and much darker. I looked in the mirror, and that's when my heart stopped. My reflection was there, but it was delayed. Just by a fraction of a second. I would blink, and a moment later, the me in the mirror would blink back. And my eyes, they weren't right. The pupils were too wide, and if I tilted my head just the right way in the fluorescent light, I could see a faint, iridescent shimmer beneath the surface of the iris, like the oily sheen on a fly's wing. I reached for a towel, and my hand brushed against a bowl of fruit on the counter. A single orange sat there, bright and vibrant. I picked it up, desperate for a taste of something real, something that didn't taste like the court. I bit into it, and for a second, it was heaven. Then the rot hit. In my mouth, the orange didn't taste like citrus. It tasted like damp earth and ancient, fermented sugar. I spat it out, gasping, only to see that the orange was perfectly fine. It wasn't the fruit that was spoiled. It was me. My senses had been calibrated to the feast, and now, the world of the living was rejected by my own tongue. I sat on the edge of the tub, listening to the hum of the pipes in the walls. Before the ritual, that sound was just plumbing. But now I could hear the rhythm in it. It was a low, steady vibration that matched the heartbeat I'd heard in the court. I was home, but I was a stranger. I had kept my memories, but I had lost the ability to enjoy them. I remembered the smell of rain, but when it actually started to pour outside my window, all I could smell was the cloying, sweet decay of Beelzebub's breath. I had escaped the cage, but the architect had left his mark on the blueprints of my soul. I was back in the world of men, but I was looking at it through the eyes of a monster. The thing about a traumatic experience is that everyone tells you time heals. They tell you that, eventually, the edges of the memory will dull and you'll blend back into the rhythm of normal life. But they're wrong. Some doors don't just close behind you, they leave a gap wide enough for something to crawl through. It's been months since that final night, and on the surface, I've recovered. I go to work. I talk to people. I pretend the world isn't a thin, paper and paste stage set. But the lingering shadow is always there, right at the periphery of my vision. Have you ever noticed how, in a perfectly quiet room, there's still a sound? A high-pitched ring, or a low-frequency thrum that you usually just ignore. I can't ignore it anymore. To me, that isn't white noise. It's the sound of the court, still buzzing just one vibration away from our reality. Sometimes I'll be sitting in a crowded cafe, and for a split second, the chatter of the people around me will sync up. The pitch will rise, the vowels will stretch, and I'll hear it, the chorus of the damned, singing through the mouths of strangers. But that's not the worst part. The worst part happens at night. I'll be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and a single housefly will land on the wall. Just one. An ordinary, buzzing nuisance. I'll get up to swat it, but as I move closer, it doesn't fly away. It stays perfectly still, watching me with those thousands of tiny, fractured eyes. And in that moment, I don't feel anger. I feel a terrifying sense of recognition. I wonder if I really won that trial of wills. Or if Beelzebub is just a patient god. Maybe the sacrifice wasn't my memory. Maybe the sacrifice was my peace. He told me I'd be a stranger in my own life, and he was right. I look at the people I love, and I see the skeletal geometry beneath their skin. I look at the beautiful world, and I see a banquet waiting to go sour. I'm a citizen of the abyss now, just living on a temporary visa in the world above. So, I leave you with this. Before you go looking for the ancient things, the gods that starved in the dark, the warlords who traded their souls for a throne, ask yourself one thing. If you go to the Court of Beelzebub, you might be clever enough to find the way out. You might even be strong enough to keep your soul. But once you've heard the king's song, how are you ever going to live with the silence again?